Yeah, you're muted, Dr. Nancy.
Sorry about that. Okay. Thank you for the introduction. And I also wanted to add, just to kind of give you a little bit of additional background in terms of my experience as well. So I've worked like across the lifespan, so you can kind of hear a little bit about some of the work experience I have, but I actually started as a child psychologist. So I did initially work with children, initially doing evaluation, assessment, and therapy. So for a number of years, I worked actually in early intervention, assessment, and care coordination, particularly for children with special needs. So my background is diverse in terms of looking at caregiving in this scope with a lot of different groups. So I hope this presentation resonates, it's helpful, and definitely look forward to questions you may have. So I'm going to take a moment right now to share my screen and get my presentation. Okay. I just want to confirm everybody can see the screen, the presentation. Yes. All yes. Right. Okay, great. So welcome. And today the presentation is going to really focus on caring for the caregiver. And my goal today is really to kind of give a broad perspective with regards to caregiving. So it will encompass all age groups. There will be some information that might be specific to a particular population, but broadly, I think it will resonate for all different groups. So in terms of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to define and discuss caregiving. I'm really going to talk about an important issue in terms of caregiver stress and burnout. And I'm also going to talk about supports and resources. So when we talk about caregiving, I think it's a really unique journey. And I think the definition of it is so broad. And I think one of the things that I found was that so many people characterize it in different ways. So some people see it as an art, it's a profession, it's a partnership, it's a commitment, it's a journey. And it's a roller coaster of experience that has its highs and lows. But it's important in terms of discussing because, one, I want to say that informal family caregiving plays such a vital role in terms of providing support for special groups. And when I talk a little bit about the sort of significance of it, I want to kind of provide some facts and information, kind of understanding how integral and significant this is. So when we talk about caregiving and its importance, particularly in this society, what we see is that we have 45 million Americans who provide unpaid care to adults, and that's at an average of 20 hours of just caring for. And in terms of children, there's 16.8 million caregivers, and we have about 20% of children who are also provided care by family members. And in terms of time spent, you can see that family members also play a large role in terms of caring. So you see the facts of 13% family members provide 40% of care a week or more. So it's really significant in terms of how important family members are in terms of caring for those who need special services or special help. And in terms of the value, how important it is to kind of talk a little bit about how much money in terms of the value of this care. So when they looked at the estimate of how much money goes into caregiving in terms of the family hours spent, $306 billion per year. So really important in terms of how family care plays a role, not only in the economy, but also in the emotional support and care of family members who have chronic conditions, who have long-term conditions. And I also want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of family members who provide the care. What we tend to see is that family members who provide care typically are women, so 66% are women. And they play, and I don't want to just say women, but also men play a role in terms of caregiving as well. But what's really important is that it's a vital role that family members play in terms of the healthcare system. And when we talk about caregivers, we see that there's like a whole variety of what a caregiver, who can be a caregiver. It can be a family member, it can be a friend, it can also be professional who is paid to provide this service. So it comes in sort of a variety of ways. And I even want to go a little bit more specific, because caregiving, it varies across age, race, ethnicity. And so I like this chart because it really kind of represents how caregiving kind of can be displayed in all sort of age ranges. So we can see young parents who have to care for children, or who have to care for young individuals in terms of care. Grandparents also play a role in terms of helping to support either through guardianship. We see that adult spouses play a role in terms of helping support medical needs of those who need care. We also see even neighbors and friends who play a role in terms of support. So that support can kind of really be displayed in so many ways. So, and again, can't underestimate, the spouse and the partner who also plays a role in terms of helping with the onset of illness and supporting their partners through chronic health issues. I think one of the things that's really important is to kind of look at, how does this role evolve? How do people kind of become caregivers? So what we notice is that, family plays a vital role in our society. So we care, we provide emotional support. So when a loved one becomes sick, or a child is born with a disability, family members step in, and that's what we do, right? We care for our family members and make sure that we provide that support that's needed. So it's sort of a natural transition for us to kind of be in the role of caring for a family member. But there's also paid support as well. So there are individuals who actually go into the profession of supporting and providing care for those individuals who need that support and assistance. So important to kind of look at some of the characteristics of caregivers. So what we noticed, this is one study, and it was done by another psychologist in terms of her study, which looked at 2,000 caregivers. And what she noticed is that oftentimes in terms of caregiving, predominantly women fall into that role. And in terms of age, you can see the age gap in terms of the age range. Care can fall anywhere from someone under the age of 30 who's caring for parents, children, and can actually go up until 60 plus in terms of providing care. So individuals can fall into that role at any age in terms of helping out a family member. Now, one of the things that we've seen, and this is sort of important in terms of looking at the role, what happens in terms of those who provide care is some of the things that
what's up?
demands of the care.
Lost 20 bucks, it was $20 bill on the stairwell.
I don't know, man. No
Okay,
idea.
I just want to make sure everybody's mic's off. So just in terms of like some of the care needs that we see for individuals, for adults, what we see is that the care needs involve companionship. It involves medication supervision. It involves transportation. It involves activities of daily living. So these are some of the demands that kind of come upon those who kind of step into the role of caregiving. And what we see for children sometimes, which is a little broader, is that when you're caring for someone who is, young and requires sort of that attention and supervision and care, even more needs and demands. So making sure that the home care and community needs and resources are available. And for children, we're looking at educational, physical, developmental, emotional, behavioral support. So all of these are sort of vital roles that we have as caregivers when caring for someone who is in need. And one of the things that happens is that for caregivers is, how do you navigate all of these sort of challenges, making sure that the individual who you're caring for all these needs are being met. And so we're going to talk a little bit about caregiver stress in a few more slides. I think what's important in terms of caregiving is, and maybe some of you can even share a little bit about this. So I talked a little bit about like some of the demands and the needs. So when you step into that role, there's a lot of responsibilities that happen in terms of caregiving. But what's also important is that in terms of the research, there's actually a trajectory of caregiving. So it kind of identifies some of the stages that caregivers go through once they step into that role. So one of the things I'm going to do is talk a little bit about those stages and see if anyone kind of identifies with any of these stages. So the first stage is the expectant caregiver. So it's more so that stage of wanting to learn, what am I going to face? How do I help my loved one? I'm accepting this responsibility. I have to think about the future and making sure that I prepare. So this is a sort of the phase of like kind of educating, learning what needs to happen as I kind of step into this stage. Now, the freshman stage is that you're already kind of in it. You're actually providing the care. You're actually taking on some of those responsibilities. You're caring for your loved one, whether you're supporting them in terms of activities of daily living, so doing errands, providing medication, feeding. In terms of children, it would be making sure that appropriate schooling, appropriate care coordination and services are in place. So you're actually right sort of in the midst of caring for your loved one. And during this stage, also there's still a learning process that's going on. You're really educating yourself, kind of understanding the diagnosis that your loved one has, whether it's a medical condition, whether it's a mental health condition, a disability. This is the time that one is sort of acquiring the education and finding out, okay, what are the resources that are out there that can help me sort of navigate and allow my family member to reach their potential. So stage 3 in terms of caregiving is like you're really sort of in the thick of it. You are like full swing of caregiving. You really begin to establish routine. You kind of know what the needs are. This is the stage also that caregivers start to really experience the stress of like, wow, this is a really huge responsibility that's I'm undertaking. And not only kind of understanding that responsibility and carrying it through, but also realizing that this definitely does consume a lot of my time and energy. I'm here for my family member, but it is realizing like, wow, this is a huge responsibility and there is a level of stress that's associated with kind of understanding that this is going to be a long process. This person, my family member, is going to need this care. And this may go on for years. And so what happens is this perception of like, wow, this is a huge undertaking. And then the level of stress starts to kind of build up. So for stage 4, which is the transitioning caregiver, it's really kind of understanding sort of, okay, recognizing the needs of your loved one, but also understanding your loved one's ability and how they're able to meet some of those care needs, and realizing that you're also kind of not only realizing the responsibility, but when you're working with older adults, also kind of realizing, wow, there's a loss here. There's a loss in terms of my parent is not functioning as independently, kind of coming to the acceptance of a loved one decline in functioning, decline in cognitive functioning, and not being at that level that you kind of remember. So there's sort of this recognition of decline and realizing that this need, again, is a prolonged one, and kind of coming to terms with that. Now, the later stages of caregiving is actually stage 5, and where the caregiving journey, and this is mostly for like working for older adults, is coming to an end, right? And so there is a period of mourning. There is a period of like exhaustion, kind of realizing like, how much it has taken emotional toll in terms of caring for a loved one. There's also a grief in terms of realizing that this role is no longer yours because the person has passed away. So this is a period, again, more sort of focused on older adults. Now, I would say there is a level in terms of no longer being a caregiver that happens for adults who have disability, where parents sometimes come to a stage of having to place their loved one in a facility. And sometimes there's a grieving process that comes there when they're no longer able to provide that care, or the person needs to transition into a care facility where they can sort of gain some independent skills. So sometimes that's a process too that actually causes a lot of grief and change as well for family members. And the last stage in terms of thinking about phases of caregiving is that you're no longer in that role. And this is, again, particularly for older adults who have passed on. But as a caregiver, you become an advocate. You become sort of a resource. You are sharing this information that you've learned, that journey of being able to navigate the medical system, the legal system, kind of aware of all the community services that are available. And you are sharing that knowledge with other people, with support groups. So you become that wise caregiver. And so these are sort of the stages that happen in terms of understanding the journey of caregiving. And so this is what the research kind of explores, and helpful for people to be kind of aware as they kind of transition in various phases as they enter the journey of caregiving. So one of the things that I talked about in terms of particularly happening sort of in that initial middle stage is that caregiving is not easy. And, you know, people take on that role because they love their family member and they want to be supportive. But sometimes they don't want to acknowledge that there's sort of an emotional toll that happens in the process of caregiving. And in the work that I do, you know, I've been able to kind of see, especially, let me just kind of share too, in terms of the counseling service unit, we do get families that call in terms of asking for consultation services, whether it is a family member who has a parent who has Alzheimer's, who has and are providing caregiving service, who has a child who has special needs and requires some assistance. So CSU is available to kind of even help provide resources, be a support for caregivers, because it's an integral role that caregivers play. So we want to recognize that work and, you know, show the appreciation, but also know that you're human. And as someone who's taking on this responsibility, you're also vulnerable. And one of the things that, you know, the research has shown is that caregivers are actually more at risk for depression and anxiety than the normal population. So those who are not caregivers. So it's so important to kind of recognize what are some of those things that kind of contribute to this stress. So interestingly enough, some of the risk factors in terms of understanding the stress is that women seem to be more vulnerable. And it's interesting because we talked about women actually having, typically are in that role. The other risk factor is fewer years of education. So fewer years of formal education also places individuals at risk. But I'm going to talk about some other factors too that's important to kind of talk about and just recognize, because again, this is an undertaking, one that is voluntary, but also kind of recognizing how it can impact you emotionally, physically, and understanding just one's overall emotional functioning as a caretaker. So when we talk about stress, what are some of the things that contribute to it? Let's kind of talk a little bit about that. So some of the things that contribute to stress. So if as a caretaker, you have health issues, that definitely can be a risk factor. So if you have a chronic issue, health issues, heart disease, diabetes, or any sort of health problem definitely can be a characteristic that can actually increase the level of stress in this role. One of the things that I find in terms of a challenge for caregivers, and this is on various levels, assisting with just the day-to-day. So think about, managing your own life in terms of your own responsibilities, your job, your own financial status, your bills, and also taking on those of a loved one. So when I talk about activities of daily living, so it could be mobility, it could be showering, it could be feeding. Those can be demands that actually increase the level of stress. Other challenges that actually come up, and this is also for all populations, whether it's a child or whether it's an adult, sort of the concerns with medication and managing medication, ensuring medication is being taken on time, refilling medication, medical bills. And this is something that applies on all levels, whether it's a child, whether it's an adult, whether it's a teen, in terms of vulnerable populations. Those are things that caregivers are navigating. Any legal issues. So for older adults, sometimes it's estate management, it's funeral planning, end of life planning. All of these things can be a strain and a stress for caregivers as they're thinking about their loved ones. Another thing that we found too, in terms of contributing to stress, is kind of identifying supports. Are you doing this alone? Do you have friends and family that are kind of supporting and can also be part of your support team and caring for your loved one? So when individuals do not have those social connections and they're doing this alone, we see those caregivers are more vulnerable to mental health issues, whether it's stress, it's depression or anxiety or both. Other challenges and identified stressors is that the financial burden of care. So, and it's interesting to kind of think about this in terms of there is a monetary sort of association with care too. So it may be, caring for a loved one, medical bills, and perceived burden also can mean like impacting one's work hours. So sometimes people have to kind of change their work schedule in order to kind of care for family members, and that can also impact work and income. So those are things that are important to kind of recognize. Lastly, another factor that's been identified as contributing to stress as a caregiver is sometimes the perceived lack of rewards. Do you find that, by doing this, you're appreciated? You're taking the time to kind of care for your loved one. Is that appreciation being kind of expressed or seen, or you're viewing it yourself as something that you appreciate in terms of caring for your loved one? So really important to kind of just identify or discuss some of these sort of stress factors that can contribute to mental health issues. So as we talk about depression and stress, it leads to kind of caregiver burnout. And when we talk about burnout, we're kind of familiar with work burnout. Well, there's caregiver burnout too. So it's sort of a state of just real exhaustion, physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion in terms of being in the role of caregiver. And again, it looks like fatigue, it's anxiety, it's depression. So it's really important that sometimes caregivers don't realize that they're actually in a state of burnout. And so important to kind of recognize those signs. And some of those things are irritability. So if you're noticing that you're frustrated and you're angry and your patience and your tolerance is low, those are some signs of just, caregiver burnout. Just feeling really unmotivated, just fatigue. Again, signs of burnout. So it's important to kind of recognize that sometimes it's hard for us to kind of sit and take account of what we're experiencing. but that awareness and sort of being able to recognize that as a caregiver is important. You want to be able to be in that role and provide care. And also sometimes the care recipient, your loved one, can kind of also recognize the burnout. So when you're kind of feeling exhausted and not present, family members recognize that too. So it's so important that caregivers are taking care of themselves. I want to kind of share some numbers, which are really important in terms of looking at mental health issues that really surface for family care caregivers. So caregiver.org basically, and this is sort of a broad number, and this basically looks at all caregivers. So whether you're caring for an adult, whether you're caring for a child, they conducted a study in 2017. And what they found was that 20% of caregivers suffer from depression. And I kind of looked at various studies, and I think overall, in terms of looking at mental health outcomes of caregivers, one of the things that was coming up repeatedly was depression. And so I'm going to share the study that was done by CDC very recently, and it found that caregivers who were kind of caring for older adults, they found an adverse mental health and behavioral health symptoms, which was basically depression and anxiety is what they kind of noticed. Another thing that the CDC study also kind of found in terms of stress, sometimes how do we cope with stress? Sometimes there's negative ways of coping with stress. So there was actually increased use of substance abuse for caregivers as well, which was a negative adverse outcome in terms of coping with the stress. One of the scariest facts that kind of came out of the CDC study, which looked at 2,000 caregivers, was that some caregivers actually reported suicidal ideation. So think about sort of the emotional toll of caring and how it can actually impact one to feel really quite vulnerable. So that was really a fact that I thought important to share in terms of just as caregivers recognizing when one needs support, when one is feeling down, when one is feeling very challenged. What's important about this study, I think too, the CDC study, it was taken in December of 2020. So it was actually during the period of COVID. So just imagine for many caregivers how COVID added another layer of stress, given sort of the shutdown and the limitation of services that were available, or how services had to change in a way that caregivers and care recipients had to adapt to. So also important to kind of just recognize. Okay, this study here actually was done through CDC as well. And this one actually focused more so on caregivers who had children who had disabilities. And again, in terms of this study, basically kind of talking about just the high prevalence of depression and anxiety. So I think one of the things I'm kind of sort of stressing in terms of looking at the research is how caregivers can be vulnerable to mental health issues, particularly depression and anxiety. So, in terms of burnout, I talked a little bit about it, but I also want to kind of identify some more signs to kind of think about in terms of what that may look like as a caregiver feeling and experiencing burnout. So I talked about like easily frustrated and the irritability, the fatigue, not enjoying things, like, so not like doing hobbies, not, enjoying a movie, just kind of realizing like things are not as pleasurable as they used to be. We also see memory changes, like get a little foggy, not as clear-headed, and also the feeling of hopelessness. And I think one of the things to really sort of be aware of it and be acknowledged is that if that feeling of hopelessness increases, it can translate into suicidal thoughts. So important as caregivers to kind of identify those signs of realizing I need help. I need help, and it's okay to kind of acknowledge that. Okay, some just additional signs of burnout. One of the things that came out of various studies is that caregivers, as they're putting a lot of energy and time for their loved ones, sometimes they're not caring for themselves. So one of the things we also see in terms of burnout is not caring for oneself. So not going to the doctors and attending to your own medical needs. That's one of the things really important. Other sort of manifestation of burnout is also somatic issues. So thinking about like body aches, headaches, physical issues are also important to recognize. Change in appetite, just not hungry, not having, or eating too much, are things to kind of recognize as changes that are going on that may be as a result of stress. Okay, so, what do you do? So what are some of the things that are important in terms of kind of coping and dealing with the stress? So this group is sort of a great example, finding a group that, you can connect with people and you can find support, share resources, communicate important information is really important in terms of being able to manage the stress. Physical activity, so any kind of exercise, thinking about your diet, how are you kind of managing eating healthy? Are you getting enough sleep? So all the sort of those care needs, healthcare needs that are important in terms of remaining healthy, remaining hydrated, getting appropriate sleep, all very important. I think one of the things that I like to tell caregivers too is just take some time out for yourself. Go have dinner, go to a movie, go do something that you really enjoy, and just kind of devote that time for yourself, whether it's at home or whether it's outside, just kind of really being able to focus on giving yourself that sort of self-care and attention that you may not always allow yourself to have. Also important too is, kind of staying positive. So when those sort of feelings of being challenged or feeling really down, how do you kind of uplift yourself, So, thinking about, affirmations, thinking about being around people who kind of support and uplift you and help you to feel more positive is really important too. Other things that are important, as I mentioned before, I talked about it in the previous slides, really important to kind of recognize when you are starting to feel stress. So looking at yourself emotionally, physically, health-wise, in terms of those changes and identifying your stress. And I think one of the hardest things for caregivers is to kind of say, I'm feeling stressed. This is a lot. It is sometimes a lot, and it's okay to say that. And I think sometimes there's a lot of feelings of guilt or feeling bad that I shouldn't be saying this because this is someone I love, but it is a rewarding undertaking, but it can be a challenging undertaking too. And it's okay to kind of acknowledge that. So some coping strategies that I've kind of shared previously in terms of looking at how to kind of approach stress and caring for oneself. So we talked about stress management, which may be exercising, it may be diet changes, making sure you're eating healthy, just thinking about things that kind of help alleviate stress, whether it's playing sports, watching a movie, those things are really important. Decision making. Sometimes caregivers feel that they're the only ones that are sort of in that process of making decisions. So important to kind of think about who else can I delegate? Thinking about a plan of action. So sometimes it's helpful to kind of actually identify what the decision is, who can support in this decision, who can I delegate, and what's my plan of action so it doesn't feel as overwhelming. Time management. Sometimes it's about really thinking about establishing structure. What are some routines that might be helpful for me and for the person that I'm caring for, whether it is a parent, whether it's a child. Structure and kind of organizational skills actually help in terms of not only managing depression and anxiety, but also that level of kind of control that one has in terms of time management actually helps relieve some stress. So that structure might be really helpful. Lifestyle management, again, kind of making sure that you are engaging in activities that, you know, bring you joy, that uplift you, being around people that also are supportive. So really important in terms of looking at these 4 areas as coping approaches. I think one of the things that is really important in terms of caregiving is kind of thinking about it in a way, what makes you feel good about being this role? You know, there's so many rewards to being a caregiver. So think about those positive emotions related to it. So think about your loved one, whether it is your child, whether it's your parent, and some of those positive emotional exchanges that happen as being a caregiver. So finding that your parent is just enjoying spending time with you and just seeing you and knowing that they can count on you. Same for your child. So thinking about those positive rewards, thinking about the relationship itself, you know, when one steps into that role, there is definitely a level of appreciation in terms of the care recipient. So family members are really appreciative, and that's a reward to kind of look at as well. For a lot of people who step into this role of caregiver, there's so much meaning to being a caregiver. So when one is taking care of a family member, it really is saying that, you know what, helping my family means a lot, not only to me, but to the family in general. And this is something that I feel is purposeful, it's meaningful. There's also a spiritual connection to kind of helping families. There's sort of for many people, there's definitely a religious aspect to kind of looking at family as a spiritual connection, serving God, serving my family, this religious connection of family association there. So important to kind of look at. Logistic savvy. One of the things that I've seen definitely in the work is how when someone becomes, we talked a little bit about the stages, sort of that later stage of being an advocate, you're able to navigate the medical system, the community system, the legal system, and there's such a wealth of knowledge of just you've gained by being a caretaker that knowledge and wealth of information can be shared with others. And it also leads into a confidence because you've been able to kind of navigate these challenging situations. So there is a lot of great things that are associated with caregiving, in addition to the love and appreciation of your family member. And sometimes it's really important that we sit down and we kind of look at some of those rewards that come when we step into the role of caretaker. Okay, so other things that I guess in terms of the presentation that I hope you're able to kind of take away, and I want to kind of emphasize, is that so important that one locates the resources and support and attends workshops and seminars and conferences that can provide you with information. Support is key. I always tell families that for all of you here, again, I'm going to kind of shout out CSU. CSU is available in terms of providing support to family members. So if at any point in time you're in need of a consultation, or you yourself want to speak to a counselor to kind of talk about what it's like to be a caregiver, some of the challenges and the rewards, or need some help in terms of being able to focus on self-care, you know, CSU is here. And not only if you don't want to use our services, we also provide referrals. So if you're interested in any sort of individual care or even family care, we do see families as well. We're available, CSU is available. Other things that I also want to kind of stress is that you're not alone in this journey. There's so many people who are in the role of caregivers. So really finding that connection and finding that community of other people who are, whether it's in this group, there are other groups available as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the resources that have been helpful to various groups of people that I've worked with. So, and this is more specific to New York, but CSU is available to all FDNY members. So let me just say this, but in terms of the other resources, as I mentioned, they're more geared towards New York. I know we have some people here who are out of state, but there are also state services that are very similar that mirror what these organizations do here in New York. So here we have New York City Wells, there's Office of Mental Health, there's Easter Seals, and Easter Seals actually works with all groups, children, adults, caregivers, and actually it's a national organization. There's Well Spouse and there's Respite Care. And Respite Care, actually the National Respite Care provides services for children as well as adults. So this is an important service to kind of also be aware of, is that at times it's important that caregivers give themselves a break if they need that, if they feel they're feeling overwhelmed. And there's Respite Care where individuals come in, and it's sometimes they come into the home, or sometimes they actually take the individual in terms of just short term to give the caregiver sort of a break in terms of a reset, a pause, so that they can kind of be able to kind of regain themselves and focus on the caregiving responsibilities. Other organization or state government agencies, there's New York State Office of People with Disabilities, New York State Developmental Disabilities and Planning. There's the Center for Parent Information and Resources. So there's a lot of resources out there, online, offices out there. So really important to just be aware of how to obtain the supports and resources needed when you step into that role of caregiver. So that is all that I have for today in terms of talking about caregiving, defining it, looking at the trajectory, really talking about the stress and identifying burnout, some of the supports and resources, and some of the coping strategies when one steps into that role. So now I am open for questions if anyone has any questions.
Agnes, you want to just end the screen share, and I'm going to turn off the recording now so that this portion, thank you, that was terrific, and it's available now for people that couldn't make the meeting, but I'll turn it off right now.
Okay, there we go.